It is 9:40 p.m. on the 22nd of October 1944, and at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire, an armourer named Ellis kneels in the mud beneath the open bomb bay of a Lancaster, torch clenched between his teeth, checking the fuse pocket of a grey 6-foot cylinder that looks nothing like a bomb. Rain drums on the corrugated roof of the nearby hangar. Somewhere behind him, an engine coughs into life, then another, until the dispersal point shakes with the sound of 16 Merlin engines warming in the dark. Ellis runs his thumb along a seam in the casing, feels for the telltale click of the arming vane, and steps back. This particular weapon will not explode on impact. It will sink silent into 11 feet of moving water 300 miles away and wait. Above him, the bomb aimer leans out to check the load, counting mines rather than bombs for the first time in his tour. Nobody in this crew has dropped one before tonight. Within 4 hours, 4 of these cylinders will be resting on the riverbed of the Rhine near Duisburg-Ruhrort, the busiest inland port in Europe, and by morning, the German army responsible for keeping that port open will not yet know they are there. To understand why an air force built to flatten cities was, by the autumn of 1944, spending entire squadrons dropping mines into a river, one has to look at what the Rhine actually meant to the German war economy. The Ruhr Valley produced roughly 70% of Germany's coal and the great majority of its steel, but the railways serving it were already buckling under Allied bombing. Their marshalling yards at Hamm, Osnabrück and Soest cratered again and again through 1944. Barges took up the slack. A single Rhine barge, hauled by tug, could carry as much cargo as 50 railway wagons, and roughly 15 million tons of coal moved along the river network each year at the war's peak, alongside steel, ore and the finished components of tanks and aircraft bound for assembly lines further south. Duisburg-Ruhrort alone handled more tonnage annually than the port of Rotterdam. The river system was not a supporting act to German war production. For coal and heavy freight, it was very often the main one. Bomber Command had experimented with waterway attacks before, most famously in September 1943 and again in September 1944, when 617 Squadron used 12,000-pound tallboy bombs to breach the Dortmund-Ems canal aqueduct near Ladbergen, draining miles of waterway and stranding hundreds of loaded barges overnight. That operation proved a principle: cut the water and the traffic stops on its own, with no need to sink every vessel individually. Mining the Rhine itself was the logical extension of the idea, but it demanded a different kind of weapon. A naval ground mine designed for the North Sea or the Baltic sat happily on a seabed 30 or 40 feet down, triggered by the magnetic or acoustic signature of a passing ship. The Rhine, in its navigable stretches, was often less than 15 feet deep, fast-flowing and full of silt that could bury or expose a mine within days, depending on the current. The mines had to be light enough to drop by parachute from 4,000 feet with reasonable accuracy, sensitive enough to catch a 200-ton barge rather than a rowing boat, and robust enough to survive a river that behaved nothing like the sea. It fell to the engineers working within Bomber Command's mining research effort, in close coordination with the Admiralty's mine design establishment at HMS Vernon, to adapt the standard ground mine for freshwater conditions, and the redesigned casing, ballast and sensor package that emerged that autumn became the tool that made the Rhine campaign possible at all. The first large-scale sorties began in late October 1944, flown by aircraft of 5 Group and later elements of 1 and 3 groups, operating at night and at low level along carefully mapped stretches of river between Karlsruhe in the south and the approaches to the Ruhr in the north. Crews called the operation gardening, Bomber Command's long-standing code name for aerial mining, and the mines themselves vegetables, a joke that had begun years earlier with mines sewn off the Frisian Islands and stuck. Each drop required extraordinary precision. Aircraft came in low, sometimes below 1,000 feet, following the line of the river by moonlight or by the glint of water beneath flares, releasing their mines in a pattern designed to seed a stretch of channel rather than a single point, since barge masters would naturally try to hug the bank furthest from any known hazard. Over the following weeks, sorties targeted the reaches around Duisburg, Cologne, Koblenz, and the industrial stretch near Ludwigshafen, with individual raids sometimes dropping 30 or more mines along a few miles of water in a single night. By December 1944, several hundred mines had been sown along roughly 250 miles of navigable river and connecting canal. The effect on the ground, or rather on the water, was immediate and expensive to fix. German pilots and harbour masters could not simply sweep the Rhine the way naval crews swept coastal approaches. Sweeping equipment designed for the sea did not translate easily to a fast, narrow, silt-laden river, and the Kriegsmarine detachments pressed into service for the job, reinforced by naval personnel pulled from coastal duties, had no established doctrine for it. Barge captains at Duisburg-Ruhrort began refusing to move at night at all, a habit that alone slashed the port's effective throughput, since loading and unloading had traditionally continued around the clock. At Cologne, traffic queued for days waiting for stretches of river to be certified clear, certification that in several cases proved wrong when a barge later struck a mine that sweeping had missed. Insurance and liability arrangements between barge operators and the Reich Transport Ministry collapsed into disputes that slowed everything further. Since nobody wanted to send a loaded vessel into water nobody could guarantee was safe. The strain showed differently depending on where one stood. For Wehrmacht transport officers responsible for keeping coal moving to steel plants in Duisburg, Essen and Dortmund, the mining campaign turned a known plannable supply chain into a daily gamble. Officers began diverting cargo onto the already overloaded rail network, accelerating the very rail congestion the barges had existed to relieve. For the mine disposal and clearance units, mostly naval ratings, supplemented by conscripted labour. The work was slow and dangerous, involving small boats dragging cable across sections of river in the hope of triggering a mine at a safe distance, a method that worked perhaps half the time and left the rest to be discovered by whichever barge happened along next. For civilians along the river towns, particularly around Duisburg-Ruhrort and the smaller port of Wesel, the campaign meant watching loaded barges tie up for days at a stretch, their crews idle, while cranes on the dockside stood unused and coal stockpiles at the pitheads further inland grew because nothing could carry it away. Further south, around Karlsruhe and Ludwigshafen, where the chemical industry depended on the same river for raw material shipments, plant managers began keeping detailed logs of delayed deliveries, some running to a week or more, records that would later surface in post-war economic assessments of the collapse of German industry. Bomber Command's own aircrews experienced the operation very differently from the men in the crews flying deep raids into German cities. Mining sorties were shorter, often 4 or 5 hours rather than 8, and flown at altitudes that felt uncomfortably exposed, since the low-level approach needed for accurate placement left little room to maneuver if flak batteries along the riverbank opened up, which they increasingly did as the Germans reinforced anti-aircraft positions at known mining choke points near Duisburg and Cologne through the winter of 1944. Loss rates on individual gardening sorties were generally lower than on major raids into the Ruhr or Berlin, but crews spoke of the strange quiet tension of watching a river slide beneath the aircraft in the dark, aiming not at a city glowing with fire, but at a stretch of black water that gave back no confirmation the mine had even gone in correctly. If this deep dive into a lesser-known corner of the air war has been worth your time, a quick subscribe helps far more than you might think. By January 1945, the cumulative effect of mining, combined with the parallel campaign against railways and canals, had begun producing figures that alarmed even senior figures within the German war economy. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, reported to Hitler in late January that transportation, not the direct bombing of factories, had become the decisive constraint on war production. Coal deliveries to power stations and steel mills across the Ruhr and Rhineland were running at a fraction of requirements, with some plants receiving less than a third of the coal tonnage they needed to maintain output. Barge traffic through Duisburg-Ruhrort, which had handled in the region of 20,000 tons a day before the mining campaign intensified, fell at points to a small fraction of that figure as captains refused sailings, mines closed sections of channel for clearance, and rail alternatives became overwhelmed. Steel production in the Ruhr, dependent on both coke deliveries and ore shipments arriving by water, dropped sharply through the first months of 1945, a decline that mirrored, almost mine for mine, the stretches of River Bomber Command had ceded the previous autumn. Clearance crews, working through icy winter conditions with equipment never designed for the job, reported that newly swept sections sometimes claimed another barge within days, since silt movement and the sheer number of mines sown made any single clearance operation provisional at best. What shifted decisively was less a single dramatic event than an accumulation of small failures that German transport officials could no longer paper over. Where earlier in the war a blocked stretch of canal or a bombed marshalling yard could be worked around within days, by early 1945 the layered damage to rail, canal and river simultaneously left almost no redundancy in the system. Internal Reich Transport Ministry correspondence from February and March 1945, examined after the war, showed officials requesting emergency labour drafts for river clearance work that never arrived in sufficient numbers, because the same labour shortage was being felt in every other sector of the collapsing economy. Coal stocks at Ruhr power stations, once measured in weeks of supply, fell to a matter of days in several documented cases, forcing rationing of electricity to armaments plants that were themselves supposed to be producing the weapons the front line desperately needed. The mining of the Rhine had not on its own ended German war production, but it had removed the flexibility that let the German transport system absorb every other blow being landed on it, and by the spring of 1945 that flexibility never returned. In the weeks following Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied economic survey teams moving through the Ruhr and Rhineland found river traffic at a near standstill, not primarily from surviving mines, most of which had by then been located and marked, but from the accumulated backlog of unrepaired vessels, uncertain channels, and a labour force too exhausted and too depleted to restore normal operations quickly. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, compiled from German records and interviews with officials, including Speer himself, identified the combined assault on transportation, rail, canal and river alike as among the most effective elements of the entire Allied bombing campaign, more consistently damaging to war output in the war's final months than the attacks on oil refineries or aircraft factories that had absorbed so much more attention and so many more aircraft. The gardening operations on the Rhine, modest in scale compared to the 1,000-bomber raids that dominate popular memory of the air war, were singled out specifically for the disproportionate return they delivered relative to the number of sorties flown. Back at RAF Waddington, had Ellis returned to the dispersal point on a clear night in May 1945, he would have found it quiet. The mud dried to hard-packed earth, the Lancasters gone or grounded, their bomb bays empty for the first time in years. The mines he armed that October night are still, in places, part of the Rhine's silted history rather than its current danger, cleared over the months and years that followed by teams working the same stretches of water his squadron once seeded in the dark. He never knew, watching that torch beam pick out the fuse pocket in the rain, that the cylinder in front of him was designed to defeat a river rather than a target he could see, or that its quiet work, repeated hundreds of times over that winter, would help starve the furnaces of the Ruhr of the coal they needed to keep burning. What he knew, stepping back from the bomb bay and giving the ground crew the signal to close it up, was simpler. The aircraft was loaded, the weather was clearing, and there was a river waiting 300 miles to the east that would look by morning exactly the same as it always had, and would never again be quite as safe to cross.